It probably goes without saying, though when does that ever stop me? Seriously, a core reality of life for me is that there's just nothing in my life that rivals my affection and my devotion that I feel for my only child. I have found in recent years that I've always said that the lottery was a form of punishment for people that didn't do well in math class, that the chances of winning the lottery are so minute that you just have to be kind of crazy to buy a ticket. But lately, I will buy one now and then, and honestly, not for myself, but if there was one thing I'd really like to do in life that my modest salary and retirement will not afford me, I would really like for my daughter to not have to work. I would like for her to be free to choose to go back to graduate school if she wanted to, or to travel, or to just settle down and give her aging theological father a bunch of grandchildren. Valerie was just 8 years old when Paul Simon released the song that we have since called our song, Father and Daughter. The line we quote to one another in text messages and Facebook messages, and sometimes on the phone, and sometimes when we're at a Paul Simon concert, is, as long as 1 and 1 is 2, there could never be a father who loved his daughter more than I love you. But there's another verse that says, but you don't need to waste your time worrying about the marketplace, trying to help the human race, struggling to survive its harshest night. I always feel an internal conflict when that verse comes up, because I've spent my life fighting institutional poverty, defending minority rights, trying to promote peace and justice, especially in the places that are the most violent and the most unjust. But there's a part of me that really doesn't want her to have to do that. I just wish she didn't have to worry about those things. I don't want her to have to worry about 2 million people in prison, about the poor in the jungles of Nicaragua who have such a short lifespan, or those struggling to survive the harshest moments of life as a war refugee, or any myriad of other issues. And I feel conflicted about this because I know in my heart of hearts that it's wrong for me to want to protect her from those things. I'd like to remove the obstacles of life from her path. I'd like for her future to be free from problems and painful awarenesses. Yet I know, as the Buddha famously said, life is suffering. The meaning, the joy, the real pleasure and satisfaction that we can derive from our mortal lives comes not from having a carefree life, but from having a disciplined life, from having the discipline to solve your problems, to overcome them, to rise above them, to learn from them in the process, to grow strong from facing adversity. You know, in the old days, if you went to the nursery and you bought a new tree for your yard and you planted the tree, you were supposed to put 3 stakes in the ground and tie ropes to it to hold the tree up straight. And what we learned through years of doing that is that trees gain strength by standing up to storms, and that if you tie supports on them, when you take the supports off, it's quite likely that the tree will not have grown strong enough to stand up to the next terrible storm. Weathering adversity is a part of what makes us strong. The only self-help book that I have ever recommended to anyone is Scott Peck's classic work, The Road Less Traveled. I personally think that most self-help books are based on junk science and pseudopsychology, and given the perspective of some years on it, I would say at least a third of The Road Less Traveled is on thin ice. But the first section of the book, I still take as being almost too insightful to have been written by a mere mortal. It's almost too good. In that first section, he describes the 4 tools of disciplined living that make it possible for us to lead a meaningful, problem-solving life that becomes a rich life, a satisfying life, has the potential of being a joyful life, and a life in which love has the chance to grow. I mean, you really, for serious love, you really kind of have to till the soil. You have to prepare a life to be genuinely loving. Life is not always fun, and frankly, I'm pretty sure it shouldn't be. Peck says that meaning is derived not by avoiding problems, but by meeting them head on and solving them. Avoiding problem leads inescapably not only to sorrow, depression, perpetual suffering, but it can, he says, lead to mental illness. No less a thinker than Carl Jung said that all neuroses are a replacement for legitimate suffering. Having problems or facing a crisis is not what gives us emotional problems. It is not facing problems that's more likely to lead us down the path of mental illness. Peck identifies 4 tools of discipline that empower us to become problem solvers rather than problem avoiders or problem deniers. They are delaying gratification, accepting responsibility, a dedication to truth, and balancing. And I don't often do sermons in 2 parts, but I'm going to take this week and next Sunday to talk about these 4 disciplines, these 4 habits of meaningful living. 40 years ago, when Scott Peck wrote The Road Less Traveled, the whole credit card phenomenon was relatively new in the United States. The old practice, if most of us here can remember, that if you couldn't afford something, you might put it on layaway and go by the department store and make payments on it until you could liberate it and bring it home with you. Credit cards did away with layaway programs and replaced it with finance charges, and our banks started doing for us what the mafia used to do, giving you high interest loans that would likely be nearly impossible to pay off. They allowed people to indulge their whims immediately, and unlike layaway, they added these interest charges and late fees and annual dues, which have over the last 40, 50 years become the bars behind which many families become imprisoned. Buddhism's 4 noble truths teach that life is suffering, and that suffering is essentially caused by unfulfilled desires, and the way out of suffering is to give up desire and follow my 8-fold path to learn how to do that. But I suppose that's easier to say for the Buddha, since the Buddha wasn't exposed to constant TV commercials, billboards, and catalogs, tempting him with more stylish and updated orange robes and floating lotus soaps. I'm especially irritated by the advertisements of for-profit colleges that keep saying to young people, if you don't have time for a 4-year degree, if you don't have time, are they only advertising to young people that have cancer? Who doesn't have time? Are they only asking kids to go for an immediate gratification that is somehow much less than what they might have received if they disciplined themselves? My father was the youngest of 9 children, born to a farming family in southern Kentucky, and a family that had never recovered from the financial devastation of the Civil War. Even in the early years of the 20th century, those 9 kids knew that only one of them was going to stay on the farm, and the rest of them had to figure out how to go out into the world and take care of themselves. They simply couldn't feed that family on the farm. Most of those 9 children went to college. My dad was the only one that went to fight in World War II. I grew up hearing him insist that his 4 children had to go to college, but he would usually add that he just didn't get a chance to. After one of those long speeches, when we were alone, my oldest brother made the observation that Dad came back from the war with a GI Bill and that he could have gone to college more easily than any of his siblings who did go to college. The difference was he just didn't want to. Now, I wasn't there, and I never fought in a war, and my dad had a number of emotional challenges as a result of the war, but still, for most of the life of suffering that we modern people complain about, most of it is traceable to our unwillingness to delay gratification, to choose literally, as Peck says, to schedule our suffering, to do without now in favor of a better life in the future. Missouri is one of the worst states in the Union for harboring the miserable and morally bankrupt industry of payday and title loan companies. Amen. These small loan vendors start customers out on a loan at more than 250% APR. And if you can't pay that loan back, you go back and you take out another loan and another. And it can get up to right at 2,000% interest. And I know a lot of people take out those loans in desperation. They're trying to not get evicted, they're trying to pay medical bills, or they're trying just to feed their children. And that is a problem of systemic poverty. But I've known several people who got in trouble with payday loans through their gambling problem, or their drinking problem, or their drug use. And a couple even that were just trying to avoid going to work. We get lots of requests here from people who are asking for help, paying their rent, paying their utilities, paying for groceries. And obviously, we're a very small church. We can't afford to solve many people's problems that when they get to be that big. But one of the most disappointing calls I ever fielded was from a woman who had gotten herself into credit trouble because of her obsessive shopping. Her wife was a physician. They had a very large family income, but this young woman had bought hundreds of pairs of designer shoes, closets filled with expensive clothes, and she was asking me if the church would help her to pay down her debt before her wife found out about it and left her. And I said, you know that we sacrifice to feed the homeless and to send material aid to the poor in Nicaragua, but you want me to raise $100,000 to pay for your shoes. And folks, she said, yes, would you? Which ties in to the second of Peck's list of disciplines necessary to leading a meaningful life, which is accepting responsibility. Albert Camus said it succinctly, your life is the sum total of your choices. No one ever makes any progress against the suffering of life by blaming others for their circumstances. Now, I don't say that to be in denial of the facts that there are wars, there are diseases, there's corrupt governments, there's abusive families, and there are treacherously false friends. We live in a capricious universe with all kinds of unjust and unfair circumstances. But the more you invest yourself in blaming others or in blaming outside circumstances, the deeper you dig the hole of your own suffering. It is in accepting responsibility for the outcomes of your life that you find the path to overcoming them. Listen, I could give you a list of examples of absolutely unforgivable injustices that have happened to me through institutional religion and through personal dishonesty. But only I get to choose how much space inside my skull that I'm going to give to those people and those past incidents. St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, no one can hurt you without your help. Somehow, some way, we partner with the people who've tried to stab us in the back to help them to do it. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist, was captured and put into a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. And you know, folks, you talk about unfair and unjust treatment. Nazi death camp, okay? They took away his freedom. They pulled the manuscript of his life's work out of his arms and tore it up in front of him as he entered the camp. He was separated from his wife and his children, and he found out later that his wife had been killed. Then he found out his children had been killed. They forced him into slave labor in horribly inhumane circumstances, always at the edge of starvation. But in the midst of that outrageous injustice, he wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances, to choose one's own way. Evil forces can take everything away from you except that you still get to decide who you are." Stuff happens, and a lot of it is horribly unfair. A lot of it is absolutely unforgivable. And yet it is still up to you to decide who you are and how you're going to live. Accepting responsibility for your life is not a blanket denial of everything that has been done to you or every unfair circumstance that has been placed as a hurdle in front of you. Accepting responsibility is the choice to face life's challenges and to find the best possible solution that you can manage. Which circles back to my beginning point about my daughter. I love her so much that I would really love to be able to remove at least any financial hurdle to her self-actualization. Though, if you think about the people that you've known who were trust fund babies or who were, as we say, born with a silver spoon in their mouths, I can't think of very many examples where that turned out to be more of a blessing than a curse. The most miserably unhappy people I personally know are oftentimes the most financially well off. I sat at dinner with a good friend of mine years ago at a local country club, and we looked out across the golf course at houses on the other side of the golf course, some of which were the size of hotels. And I said to my friend, "Who even wants to live in a house that big?" And he, longtime attorney in town, kind of knew the ins and outs of the club, and he pointed at a 5-story house across the way, and he said, "Sam lives in the top 2 floors, Betty lives in the lower 3. They hate each other so much they haven't talked to each other in years." The world of merchandising tries to convince us that wealth equals happiness, but all of the field research tends to point in the opposite direction. What actually does make life good, meaningful, joyful, has something to do with facing and solving life's problems. Now, this is an oversimplification, but Peck writes in his book, most people who come to see a psychiatrist are suffering from what is called either a neurosis or a character disorder. Put most simply, these two conditions are disorders of responsibility. And as such, they are opposite styles of relating to the world and its problems. The neurotic assumes too much responsibility. The person with a character disorder, not enough. When neurotics are in conflict with the world, they automatically assume that it's their fault. When those with a character disorder are in conflict with the world, they automatically assume that the world is at fault. And I need to add the caveat that anything that can be put in a nutshell probably belongs there. But this synopsis of the field of psychology is useful in thinking about the kinds of mental suffering that are not actually caused by a psychosis. You can fairly accurately predict that about half of the children of an active alcoholic will become alcoholics, and many of the others will develop a borderline personality disorder. And in fact, in terms of field research, borderline personality disorders almost always emerge from an alcoholic home or the home of a religious fundamentalist. That appears to be the two sources of borderline personalities. But what should be of interest to us are the children who emerge from these homes intact. What made the difference? While most of us know of Abraham Maslow primarily for his famous pyramid illustration of our hierarchy of needs, I believe that his real contribution to psychology was his decision to focus on the strengths of his patients rather than focusing on their weaknesses, on their mental illness that first brought them to his office. People oftentimes will go to a counselor looking for a fix to the pain that they are experiencing. And the fix these days usually involves a serotonin drug and week after week of scheduling appointments to come in and talk about your pain, so that you're literally scheduling space and time to talk about what's wrong. Maslow challenged the entire field of psychology to stop thinking about illness and start thinking about health. My recently deceased friend, Dr. Todd Scheibel, repeatedly told the story to those of us that were on the board at Burrell Mental Health that when he first bought a home that had a lawn with problems, he kept going to the lawn center, buying one chemical treatment after another, trying to kill the weeds in his yard. And finally, an old man, like a sage, said to him at the home center, "Son, you need to quit trying to kill weeds and start trying to grow some grass." As you know, I'm spending most of this year working on a book about needed social change in America. But this week and next week, I really want to try to take spirituality down to the personal level and hopefully do that in a pastoral way. There is a lot of suffering in the world that is systemic, but none of that can be meaningfully addressed by a population that is addicted to blaming and refusing to accept any personal responsibility for how we're going to live against the challenges of the world. The ability to delay gratification and the willingness to accept responsibility are two aspects of growing grass rather than killing weeds. Next week, we'll talk about dedication to reality and balancing. But between now and then, let me encourage you with a proverb from the AA program. Don't think so much about how sick you've been. Think about how well you want to be.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.